The afternoon sun had that thin, dishonest brightness of late summer, the kind that made neighbors sit on their porches and practice small civility. I was in the kitchen, halfway through a podcast about forgotten sitcoms, when everything went quiet, no modem ping, no soft song of the smart lights. The house felt wrong, like a movie with its sound muted. I grabbed my phone, checked the router lights, traced the coax with fingers that suddenly felt useless. The line to the curb ended in a jagged black stub. Someone had taken a pair of cutters to it. At first, I assumed a friend had borrowed a tool, or a storm had doled out a cheap wound. Then Alex from 3 doors down knocked, holding his own cut cable like a trophy of inconvenience. "Same thing," he said. His face had that tight, small look people get when they're trying not to be angry in front of children. The cul-de-sac smelled of cut, grass and gasoline and something like the sheen of a rumor. It moved fast. Soft as gossip. We all knew the HOA's tone. Neat emails, numbered warnings, a calendar full of rules. The board had been on a crusade the last 6 months. Fines for chipped paint, for rogue lawn ornaments, for unsightly deliveries. And Karen, the woman who chaired the community committee, had a voice that cut like a ruler. She walked the streets with a clipboard like an instrument of law. She was polite as a razor. That evening, the HOA posted a curt message about scheduled maintenance on the portal, corporate language that left out violence. Accountability and apology. My cable lay on the curb like an accusation. A gnawing thought arrived. Whoever cut the wire had a point of view. Maybe it was a kid, maybe a raccoon, maybe the landscape crew. The evidence said none of those. It said intention. At midnight, I sat awake mapping in my head the infrastructure of the neighborhood. The little white speakers beneath the lampposts, the sleek dome at the clubhouse, the quiet coax lines running like veins under the asphalt. Those devices reminded people to pick up their trash and to obey pool hours. They whispered civility. The idea lodged. Not a how-to, not a technical plan, only a stubborn, moral impulse. If someone could silence my connection, perhaps the same system could be turned into a mirror. If the board weaponized shame quietly, maybe it could be forced into the daylight loudly. I did not know if the thought was brave, foolish, or both. I only knew that when your life is interrupted by a cut wire, your patience with the rulers of small things shortens by degrees. The next morning, I started paying attention. I approached it like a person testing the edges of a problem, not a criminal mastermind. First, I played the role the neighborhood expected. Polite emails, phone calls to the vendor, a formal complaint to the portal. Carter, the board president, answered with the practiced cadence of someone who had rehearsed calm. "We're investigating," he typed, which usually means someone else will fix it and nothing will change. Then I walked the neighborhood. The speakers were smaller than they looked from my porch. White, unobtrusive, attached to lampposts like low-cost sentries. They had vents, screws, and small, faded labels that said, "Community Audio." Beneath, polite paint and plaster they were. Infrastructure, created to coordinate behavior. Once you see a thing as infrastructure, you start to imagine how it might be used. I asked small questions, the mail carrier, who'd noticed a utility truck. A teenager, who'd seen a woman arguing with the landscaping crew. A dog walker, who remembered Karen standing near the clubhouse last week, clipboard raised. The answers were fragments. Not a conspiracy, petty fines here. Aggressive reminders there, a pattern of official correction that singled people out for small, expensive humiliations. With Alex's cousin, who worked nights at a recycling shop, I saw the inside of a decommissioned speaker. It looked mundane, a cone, wires, a circuit board. He didn't teach me anything technical. He only fed my curiosity. "It takes a signal. It makes sound," he said, shrugging like a man describing a toaster. It's funny how a little knowledge alters courage. I found myself drafting a message to the board. Not an attack, but an exposure. A printed list of recent fines with no context attached. Folded and slipped into the HOA mailbox. I signed nothing. I told no one. Then, on a reckless impulse, I scribbled one line on the bottom. "Listen Friday at 6. It felt theatrical and petty and relevant in the way of small rebellions. To use their own voice system to force a conversation they had been avoiding. All plans in suburbia are half the story. The rest is improvisation and luck. I had neither in abundance, only resolve and the small thrill of feeling seen. Friday at 6 felt louder than it should have. People were home. Blinds rose like small curtains at a puppet show. At 6:05, the speakers came alive with a soft, low hum that made dogs whine and radios flicker. Then a recorded voice, neutral, oddly flat, began to read a list. Fines, names, amounts, reasons. Not accusations. Just the ledger of petty condemnations made public in a way they never had been before. A birdhouse cited, a complaint about a stray flag, a gardener fined for unauthorized. Landscaping. The list had the flavor of bureaucracy and the sting of exposure. Porches filled, phones came out. Some people laughed, the way people laugh at fireworks they did not expect. Others stepped outside and listened with their faces hard. My own stomach turned. The intent had been to reveal what the board had been doing privately, to force transparency where shame and secrecy had been the tools of governance. But exposure is its own messy thing. It doesn't choose the moral victim. Then Karen's voice cut across the recording, live and furious. She shouted about vandalism and law, her tone sharpened into accusation. The contest of narratives began, a steady recitation of fines, then a boiling personal condemnation. From the woman who had been the board's most visible enforcer. Neighbors argued in the street. A few marched toward the clubhouse. Others peered from windows, whispering theories. The board posted messages to the portal about unauthorized use of community systems. Carter called for calm. The meeting that followed next week smelled of burnt coffee and defensive language. But the damage had been done. The veneer had cracked. What surprised me most wasn't the chaos but the substance of the reactions. People didn't only defend themselves. They started to tell stories of small humiliations, of rude letters, of fines that felt orchestrated. The recordings we once read aloud and became a catalyst. Karen, who had always seemed unshakable, looked smaller when her role was contested in public. Her voice still carried weight, but public scrutiny dulled it like sandpaper. The night finished with more questions than answers. The speakers fell silent, but the echo remained. I felt relief and a strange guilt. The thing had worked. But the cost had been real. People had been shamed. Friendships strained. I had wanted transparency. But a transparency that wouldn't humiliate people in the process is a hard, careful thing to design. The emergency HOA meeting filled the clubhouse with a crowd that had never before shown such appetite for confrontation. Coffee cooled on folding tables. Voices rose and fell like small waves. The board promised investigations and mediators. Carter read prepared statements. Karen defended standards with the same practiced, earnest face she always wore. But something else was happening. Neighbors, freed from the quiet grind of fines, were speaking. Stories spilled out, petty letters that felt targeted, fines that disproportionately hit renters and those who couldn't fight back. A culture of correction dressed as maintenance. The mediator asked questions that no one had asked in public before. Someone suggested a community oversight committee. Petitions circulated. The momentum felt fragile, like new chutes through pavement, but it existed. Karen fought to reclaim the narrative by describing the speakers as safety devices, essential for alerts and maintenance calls. Her argument had weight for some. For others, it rang hollow in the face of documented indignities. Accountability doesn't erase compassion. It reveals it. The community asked for both a hearing and a new set of rules. Transparency in fines, appeal processes, and clearer explanations. The board agreed, on paper at least, to bring in an independent reviewer. Weeks later, the cables were repaired, and the speakers hummed their ordinary announcements. The difference was not technical but social. People now questioned the cadence of reminders. They asked why certain complaints had become citations. They asked that shame not be outsourced to a loudspeaker. As for me, I never took credit. I watched as the board made concessions that felt small and earnest, a new appeals process, an audit of fines, and I realized that sometimes the simplest actions are to reveal rather than to retaliate. Cutting a wire had been an attack. The response had been to shine light on governance. I had used a borrowed impulse to amplify something more important: conversation. On late evenings, I walked the neighborhood and listened to the speakers, once instruments of control, now watched with a keener ear. Karen still walks with a clipboard, but conversations are different now. People ask questions. They petition. They sit in meetings and speak. The wires are fixed. Yet the hum is new. We have learned to expect our rulers to be watched.